General Hospital spoilers reveal that across Port Charles, an eerie tension has begun to settle over the city. The kind that creeps into the cracks of every storyline and coils around the lives of its residents, like a dark omen waiting to swallow them whole. For weeks, viewers have sensed an unsettling shift, a new adjustment silently rewriting destinies. A quiet but unmistakable descent into chaos for major characters. Portia, Jacinda, Drew, and Brennan now find themselves at the center of her spiraling catastrophes, each storyline collapsing inward with a force so intense that it feels as though General Hospital is preparing for one of the darkest narrative convergences in years. These four arcs do not merely run parallel, they vibrate with the same energy of impending disaster, each character standing on the edge of a precipice, without realizing just how quickly the ground beneath them is eroding. Portia Robinson's world is the first to fracture, and it happens slowly, painfully, like watching the steady cracking of glass before it inevitably shatters. She thought she had outrun her past, thought she had contained the truth long enough for the present to stabilize. But secrets in Port Charles are never buried deeply enough. The paternity battle looming over her is not merely a storyline, it is an unraveling of identity, trust, and the fragile future she tried desperately to build. Curtis's heart is on the line, Isaiah's hope is hanging by a thread, and Portia is trapped between two possible outcomes, both of them guaranteed to break someone she loves. The DNA results are more than medical data, they are emotional landmines, ticking with the force to blow apart relationships, families, and reputations. And as the tension rises, Portia begins to sense something far more terrifying than a single truth. No matter what the results reveal, the cost will be catastrophic. Her storyline is no longer about who fathered her child, it is about the collapse of control, the destruction of trust, and the haunting realization that she cannot save everyone from the truth that is racing toward them. While Portia braces for the impact of her own unraveling, Jacinda Bracken's world is collapsing in a far more jagged, gut-wrenching way. Her feelings for Michael Corinthos began as something fragile and hopeful, a spark she didn't expect after a life marked by secrets and survival. But the foundation of their connection, already unstable, begins to disintegrate the moment her past resurfaces with brutal force. Lies about her alibi, connections to Ezra, the shadows of her escort history, the trauma of being drugged, all of it begins to hang over her relationship. Like a storm cloud ready to burst, she sees it happening in real time, sees Michael's warmth cooling, sees the doubt collecting behind his eyes, sees the fear that her presence could jeopardize his future with Wiley. Jacinda's storyline becomes a tragedy unfolding in slow motion, a portrait of a woman who dared to hope for more but finds herself ripped backward by a past she cannot outrun. And fans feel the ache with her, sense the inevitable heartbreak creeping closer. Because Jacinda is not simply losing Michael, she is watching the fragile version of herself she tried to rebuild crumble back into dust. Drew Kane's downfall, however, is something darker entirely. His storyline feels like a psychological thriller disguised beneath the familiar rhythms of GH. A slow but terrifying descent into a nightmare he never saw coming. The fragments of memory that once seemed like background noise are starting to crystallize, and the picture they form is horrifying. The realization that Willow, gentle, compassionate, trustworthy Willow, may have been the one who shot him is enough to tear his world into pieces. And viewers can feel the dread building, the unraveling tightening around Drew's mind like a vice. His emotional instability bleeds into every scene, every movement, every interaction. He is haunted by shadows he cannot name, driven by suspicions he cannot validate, and spiraling toward an emotional breakdown that feels inevitable. His storyline becomes a study in psychological collapse, a man being swallowed by the weight of betrayal, trauma, and pain until he becomes unrecognizable even to himself, and his decline places everyone near him in danger, not through physical violence, but through emotional distortion, a growing unpredictability that threatens to set off a chain reaction of consequences no one can control. And then there is Jack Brennan, whose storyline explodes with the force of a full-blown Greek tragedy. He believed he had finally found something pure in Carly, a woman he loved with an intensity that blinded him to her secrets. But when the truth begins to see through the cracks, when he discovers that Carly has been playing him, using him, and scheming with Valentine Casadini behind his back, the foundation of Brennan's world caves in. The heartbreak is absolute, violent, destabilizing. It hollows him out from the inside, turning affection into obsession, longing into wrath, and disappointment into a desire for vengeance. Brennan's collapse is not gentle, it is explosive. His storyline pulses with danger, driven by the fury of a man who thought he had finally found redemption through love, only to discover that love was the most elaborate trap he had ever walked into. And as his emotional world implodes, fans sense the terrifying shift occurring beneath the surface. A man like Brennan does not break quietly. He lashes out. He retaliates. He becomes the architect of chaos. Together, these four spiraling arcs create one of the most unhinged narrative storms GH has crafted in recent memory. Portia's truth threatens to detonate her family. Jacinda's heartbreak threatens to send her spiraling into old patterns of self-destructs. Drew's mental unraveling threatens to engulf everyone around him. Brennan's devastation threatens to unleash a wave of retaliation that could ripple through all of Port Charles. And woven through each storyline is the same chilling thread. A sense that none of these characters will emerge intact. Not emotionally. Not psychologically. Not relationally. This is not just drama, it is collapse. A 4-point implosion readers can feel moving closer with every episode. Fans watching these storylines unfold are left unsettled, anxious, and strangely captivated by how deeply this new phase digs into vulnerability, identity, betrayal, and psychological trauma. These are not just plot twists, they are character dissections, emotional autopsies performed in real time, and viewers sense something even more haunting, that the endings of these four arcs might not be endings at all, but foundations for new obsessions, new dangers, new catastrophic reveals waiting in the wings. Portia's crisis will reshape her family. Jacinda's heartbreak will reshape her identity. Drew's unraveling will reshape his connections. Brennan's fury will reshape the danger level in Port Charles. These four collapsing arcs signal a massive adjustment in GH's storytelling. A shift so intense that it feels like a storm front rolling in slow at first, then suddenly unstoppable. And as the emotional destruction intensifies, fans cannot look away. Because beneath all the chaos, all the heartbreak, all the unraveling, lies a deeper truth. The fall of these four characters is only the beginning. Their endings are not endings at all. They are the first tremors of a much darker earthquake still to come. Across Port Charles, an unsettling shift begins to spread like a silent contagion, weaving its way through every storyline and settling around for characters whose destinies have suddenly begun to crack under the pressure of long-buried truths, broken trust, and irreversible consequences. Portia, Drew, Jacinda, and Brennan, once central figures holding their own threads together, now find themselves drifting toward exits shaped not by closure, but by collapse. Their departures do not feel peaceful or reflective, they feel like detonations, each one tearing open a new fault line that exposes a darker pulse, pushing General Hospital into territory it has not touched in years. And as these four unravel in four distinct directions, the weight of their exit begins pressing down on the shoulders of Michael, Willow, and Carly, who are unknowingly standing at the doorstep of a new nightmare forming from the ashes left behind. Portia's departure begins with a whisper of scandal and ends with the implosion of everything she spent years trying to hold together. Her family fractures beneath the weight of contested paternity, eroded trust, and the revelation that the truth she concealed has finally devoured the future she hoped to protect. Curtis' heartbreak, Isaiah's disappointment, Trina's shaken loyalty, each piece of emotional shrapnel cuts into Portia, until there is nothing left for her in Port Charles but the faint echo of what might have been. Her exit becomes quiet but devastating, a retreat fueled not by cowardice but by exhaustion. A choice made by a woman who has finally accepted that no apology, no sacrifice, no desperate attempt at repair will ever mend the wound she inadvertently created. She leaves behind a home full of ghosts, a daughter who will question her for years, and a truth that now hangs over the Ashford and Gannon families like a permanent shadow. Jacinda's departure follows a different path, less quiet collapse, and more tragic unraveling. What began as a fragile hope for redemption quickly becomes a battlefield of betrayal, trauma, and emotional exposure. Her feelings for Michael, once tender and unexpected, crumble beneath the pressure of lies, legal danger, and the resurfacing of a past she never truly escaped. When Michael pulls away, it is not simply a breakup. It is an eviction from the only semblance of acceptance Jacinda had allowed herself to imagine. The judgment from those around her, the fallout from her escort history, the consequences of the alibi deception, and all converges into a storm that forces her out of Port Charles not with anger but with a hollow, irreversible sense of defeat. She leaves because staying would mean drowning in a city that never forgave her for a life she fought so hard to escape. Her exit becomes a cautionary tale of how hope can turn poisonous when it is rooted in unstable ground. Drew's exit, however, does not resemble collapse. It resembles catastrophe. The psychological unraveling that began with scattered memories, unstable emotions, and creeping suspicion evolves into a full-blown crisis. When the truth about Willow's involvement in his shooting finally pierces a fog of trauma, the shock fractures his sense of identity, splits open every scar he buried after years of trying to rebuild himself, and sends him spiraling into a free-fall he cannot break. As his grip on reality loosens, the people around him become symbols of betrayal, danger, or abandonment. His relationships begin to fracture under the weight of paranoia. His judgment deteriorates, His inability to process the truth transforms him into a danger to his family, to himself, to anyone trying to pull him back from the edge. His departure becomes something raw and violent, a forced exile brought on by emotional implosion rather than intent. He is removed from Port Charles like a storm being pushed out to sea, still powerful, still dangerous, still unresolved, leaving behind a trail of emotional wreckage that will haunt the city long after he is gone. And then comes Brennan, whose exit is nothing short of operatic in its devastation. For a man who thought he had found salvation in Carly, learning that he was manipulated, betrayed, and deceived, tears open a wound so deep their reason evaporates. His heartbreak transforms instantly into obsession, his pain into fury, and his humiliation into a hunger for retribution. When Brennan leaves Port Charles, it is not with sadness but with the energy of a man preparing for war. He vanishes into the shadows, not to forget Carly but to plot the kind of revenge that will scorch everything tied to her. His exit becomes a dark promise rather than an ending, a silent vow that he will return. And when he does, the destruction will be personal, calculated, and absolute. Brennan's departure is not closure. It is the ignition of a fuse that will one day burn its way back into the heart of the Corinthos and Spencer families. But the departures of these four characters do not simply remove them from the canvas. They open voids that immediately begin to collapse inward, pulling Michael, Willow, and Carly into a vortex of emotional fallout that none of them are prepared to face. Portia's shattered family wounds intensify the instability surrounding Trina, which in turn affects the Spencer-Corinthos dynamic. Jacinda's heartbreak creates a ripple effect that touches Michael's conscience, reopening old wounds and fears he thought he buried with Wiley's custody battle. Drew's psychological descent strikes directly at the center of Willow's world, destabilizing her marriage, her identity, and her ability to trust herself. And Brennan's wrath casts a long, heavy shadow over Carly's future, a reminder that a woman who has survived countless storms may finally be standing in the path of one she cannot outrun. As the emotional consequences spread, Michael becomes a vessel for guilt, responsibility, and fear. Willow becomes a symbol of buried secrets, forced to confront the truth she never meant to unleash. Carly becomes a lightning rod for Brennan's vengeance, a woman who does not yet realize that the storm she helped create will follow her. Long after Brennan's exit, General Hospital begins to darken, not through sudden violence but through the psychological collapse of characters who once held their narratives firmly in hand. The tone shifts. The city feels colder. The air feels heavier. The exits of Portia, Jacinda, Drew, and Brennan act as catalysts, pushing GH into one of the bleakest, most emotionally chaotic eras it has explored in a long time. These departures mark the beginning of new obsessions, new threats, new hidden truths, and unspoken guilt settling over Port Charles like a fog that refuses to lift. The fans watching sense it immediately, the strange, tingling feeling that GH is stepping into a storyline filled with shadows rather than light. Every departure becomes a warning. Every unresolved secret becomes a crack in the foundation. Every emotional wound becomes an omen. And the deeper GH moves into this darkened territory, the clearer it becomes that these exits are not endings at all. They are the beginning of a much larger storm. One that Michael, Willow, and Carly will find themselves standing at the center of. And one that will reshape the future of Port Charles in ways no one can yet predict. In the shifting underbelly of Port Charles, the truth began rising like smoke from a fire that had long been burning unseen, carrying with it the stench of crimes, betrayals, and discoveries that would forever alter the balance of power across the city. What began as scattered suspicions soon hardened into revelations, exposing the deception woven by Portia and Jacinda to women who had fought their entire lives to bury their mistakes, only to have those mistakes claw their way back to the surface at the worst possible moment. Portia's carefully crafted lies about paternity, once whispered in the shadows of her conscience, now burst into the open with a violence she could not contain. Every layer of her deception peeled back like rotting wallpaper, revealing the darker truth beneath that she had manipulated the people closest to her, in the name of preserving a future that was never built on honesty at all. And Jacinda, meanwhile, found her own web of falsehoods unraveling, the distorted alibi, the concealed trauma, the compromises she made to survive a world that only punished her for trying. When her secrets spilled into the light, they didn't merely tarnish her reputation, they ignited a firestorm of judgment that consumed everything she was trying to rebuild. Together, the shattering of their lies created a ripple of consequences that destabilized families, alliances, and the fragile trust so many characters had depended on. Yet even these betrayals paled compared to the sinister plans. Drew and Brennan had been quietly constructing plans born from pain, obsession, disillusionment, and the twisted belief that they could bend the world to their will. For Drew, whose emotional fractures deepened with each passing day, his internal collapse eventually mutated into something darker, a strategy rooted not in revenge, but in desperation. His attempts to manipulate outcomes, control narratives, and mold the truth into something that protected his fragile identity, spiraled into a dangerous scheme that risked pulling innocent people into the crossfire, and Brennan, already consumed by the hurt Carly inflicted, funneled his heartbreak into a meticulous plot of vengeance. His intelligence, once a tool to maintain order, now served the darker impulses that grew from betrayal. The plan he built in the shadows was calculated enough to terrify even those who only glimpsed fragments of it, an intricate design of retaliation that threatened to destabilize not just the lives of those who wronged him, but the city as a whole. But in a twist Port Charles never saw coming, the dark machinery behind Drew and Brennan's schemes began to collapse under its own weight. The more the truth surfaced about the harm they intended, the data they manipulated, the lies they spread, the fear they cultivated, the more inevitable their downfall became. Their plans crumbled like brittle stone, shattered by the revelations that exposed their motivations and dismantled their illusions of control. And as their influence disintegrated, Port Charles felt a subtle shift in the air, a thinning of the suffocating tension that had hung over its residents for months. The city began to breathe again, not because it was safe, but because two of its most dangerous players had finally been silenced. Yet any hope of peace was short-lived. With Drew and Brennan removed from the board, a new threat rose in their place, one far more calculated, far more patient, and far more terrifying. Sidwell, whose influence had been quietly spreading like a shadow stretching across the walls of Port Charles, now stepped forward into a position of staggering power. His manipulation, once subtle enough to evade suspicion, grew sharper, bolder, more invasive. He had studied the weaknesses of the city like a surgeon examining a wound, learning where to press, where to cut, and where to strike for maximum devastation. With the collapse of Drew's stability and Brennan's empire, Sidwell found himself with a vacuum of power ready to be filled, and he wasted no time doing so. His control seeped into political structures, legal channels, and private lives, turning him into a force whose reach now extended far beyond personal vendettas. As the truth about Portia and Jacinda came to light, as Drew and Brennan's plans imploded, Sidwell quietly expanded his network, absorbing resources, contacts, and influence with the precision of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The crimes and betrayals of others became the stepping stones that elevated him, each downfall another brick in the throne he was building. With every secret exposed, he grew stronger. With every family fracture, he tightened his hold. And with every shattered loyalty, he became more untouchable. Port Charles, thinking it had narrowly avoided disaster, failed to recognize that it had simply traded one threat for another, one far more prepared, far more cunning, and far more relentless. Sidwell's rise marked the beginning of a new reign of fear, one driven not by impulse like Brennan or emotional collapse like Drew, but by cold, masterful strategy. His presence became a shadow stretching over every character, a whisper in every corridor, an unease coiling in every storyline. And as the tension grew, so did the terror, because everyone knew, though no one dared admit, that Sidwell was not finished. He was only beginning. The city now moved under an invisible pressure, a psychological weight pressing down on every decision, every interaction. The sense of safety that briefly flickered after Drew and Brennan's downfall was quickly extinguished by the realization that Sidwell's power was not simply rising, it was multiplying. His hold on Port Charles was tightening like a vice, slowly enough that no one noticed the initial squeeze, but forcefully enough that soon, no one would be able to escape. The revelations of crime and betrayal had opened a door that could not be closed. The removal of two dangerous men had cleared the path for a far more dangerous one. The chaos Portia and Jacinda unleashed through their lies had weakened the fabric of trust. The collapse of Drew and Brennan had destabilized the emotional core of the city. And now, Sidwell was stepping into the ruins with a vision no one could yet see but everyone could feel. An aspiration toward dominance disguised as order. A plan cloaked in silence. A threat that was growing louder with every passing day. Port Charles was becoming darker. Not because of the villains who had fallen, but because of the one rising in their place. And as the shadows deepened, the city braced for the next revelation, knowing it would not be a confession or a heartbreak, but a warning. Because when Sidwell expands his power, the danger doesn't fade. It evolves. It intensifies. And it always comes with a price. The first signs of danger crept into Port Charles, long before anyone realized the storm was already circling. Sonny Corinthos and Laura Collins, two legends who had survived more betrayals, wars, and resurrections than anyone could count, found themselves standing once again at the center of a threat no one had predicted. The city they had defended for decades was beginning to shift beneath their feet, not because of a single villain, but because of the possibility that the past long buried long mourned, long feared was preparing to rise again. What began as faint whispers in the background soon swelled into a terrifying possibility. For ghosts of Port Charles might return, not as memories, not as hallucinations, but as living forces ready to reclaim the futures that had been stolen from them. Nell Benson, Morgan Corinthos, Brenda Barrett, Sam McCall, for names that once defined entire eras of chaos, heartbreak, and obsession, now carried the weight of unfinished business, and GH seemed ready to pull them back into the light, with new faces, new energy, and new agendas. For Sonny, the danger began with a sense of déjà vu he couldn't shake. The patterns felt familiar, the anonymous threats, the cryptic sightings, the sudden shifts in territory, the feeling that something or someone was testing him. He had weathered every kind of betrayal, but this one felt different. It felt personal, intimate, orchestrated by someone who knew him better than an enemy should. Laura sensed the same darkness creeping into her world, a shadow pressing against the edges of her stability. Sidwell tightening his grip, Valentine disappearing, Charlotte unraveling, secrets stirring in corners. She didn't want to revisit. Everything pointed to a larger force, assembling behind the scenes, and the air felt charged with the promise of something catastrophic. And then the rumors began. Rumors that made no sense. Rumors no one wanted to believe. Rumors that suggested the dead or the presumed dead might not be dead at all. Nell Benson, whose body had never been found. Morgan Corinthos, whose death had always lingered with too many unanswered questions. Brenda Barrett, whose disappearances had become a legend of their own. Sam McCall, whose off-screen exit left wounds a story never truly healed. GH fans felt the tremor immediately, the kind of shift that only happens when the show prepares to unleash something historic. A new wave of recasts for returns, for impact zones ready to crash into Sonny and Laura's lives with force strong enough to tear open every old wound still bleeding beneath the surface. If Nell returned, no matter her face, her voice, her form, Port Charles would burn. No one was more dangerous, more unhinged, more unpredictable. She would come back not for redemption but for revenge. Revenge on Willow. Revenge on Carly. Revenge on the entire Corinthos Quartermain universe. And Sonny, who had lived through countless manipulations, would find himself facing the most cunning adversary he had ever known. A woman who could shift between victim and monster with terrifying ease. Laura, too, would feel the ripple effect. Every system she relied on, legal, moral, political, would collapse under the weight of Nell's ability to twist truth into chaos. Morgan's return, on the other hand, would not come as an attack, it would come as an emotional earthquake. His death had fractured Sonny beyond repair, leaving trauma that never quite healed. The thought that Morgan might have survived, hidden, brainwashed, manipulated, or stolen away would destabilize Sonny more than any bullet or betrayal ever could. Laura would see the danger immediately. The return of a son might save Sonny, but it could also destroy him if the truth behind Morgan's disappearance was darker than a lie that Port Charles had been told. Then there was Brenda Barrett, the eternal flame in Sonny's history, the woman whose presence had always carried equal parts beauty and destruction. If she returned, whether as a recast or a reimagined version of herself, old emotions would ignite instantly, and not just for Sonny. Carly's life would be shaken to its core. Jax's name would echo again. Valentine, who once took Brenda from a villa in Europe, might find himself facing a piece of his past that refused to stay buried. Brenda's return would not be romantic, it would be catalytic, triggering shifts in power and emotion that the city had not seen in years. And finally, Sam McCall, not dead but gone, not forgotten but displaced. Her return, especially if the story rewrote her with a darker, sharper, more battle-worn version of herself, would bring a new dimension to Sonny and Laura's war. Sam had always existed in the space between hero and morally gray survivor, and Port Charles needed someone like her now more than ever. A recast could breathe fire into her storyline, restoring her connections to Dante, Christina, Alexis, Scout, and Jason in ways that would shake every foundation around Sonny's empire. If Sam returned at the same moment Nell, Brenda, and Morgan stepped back into the narrative, GH would transform overnight into a battlefield where past, present, and future collided with explosive consequences. Sonny and Laura, two pillars of Port Charles, would find themselves fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously, not just against Sidwell, whose influence spread like an infection, but against the emotional detonations triggered by the return of her figures, whose existence reshaped the city itself. Every old loyalty would be tested. Every relationship would be threatened. Every secret long buried would claw back to the surface with new implications. And GH would enter a new era defined not by romance or redemption, but by legacy, by the ghosts of former storylines returning to reclaim power, love, revenge, and closure. The potential recasts of Nell, Morgan, Brenda, and Sam would not just be casting news, they would be narrative earthquakes. capable of splitting Port Charles into rival factions and moral dilemmas with no clean resolutions. Sunny's alliances would fracture. Laura's political stability would collapse. Carlyle's world would be torn open from multiple angles, Nell attacking Willow, Brenda resurrecting old rivalries, Morgan returning with scars no one could comprehend. Michael and Willow, already unstable, would be thrust into a psychological battleground. Jason, if drawn into the mix, might find himself forced to choose between his past and his future. And the Corinthos family, already more fragile than it appeared, would risk breaking completely. With Sidwell rising, Sunny destabilizing, Laura stretched thin. And for returning forces preparing to collide, GH would enter one of the darkest, boldest, most unpredictable eras in its history, an era where the past refuses to stay dead, the present refuses to stay calm, and the future refuses to be shaped by anything but chaos. Port Charles would not merely change. It would ignite.